Well, hello again, everybody. Welcome back. This is the 8th recording for the semester. And today we are going to look at metabolism. If you want another way of looking at this, we're going to be looking at energy manipulation. How do organisms, as living entities, manipulate energy to their favor so that they can accomplish the work that they need to accomplish to do things like, well, I don't know, being alive and carrying out the chemical reactions that support being alive and allow for a lot of other things like reproduction and cell division, and the list goes on and on and on. It all comes down to the fact that these activities of living organisms are work, and work requires energy. In fact, work implies change. When work is done, change happens. And a really good definition of energy, and perhaps we can start right here, a good definition of energy is that which has the capacity to cause change. So if change is happening, and that we know is happening when work is done, then energy has to be present, because energy is what provides the capacity for that change to happen. So if you want to be alive, that requires work. If you're going to do work, then you're going to be causing change. But if you're going to be causing change, you need energy, because energy is the only thing that has the capacity to cause change. So all of these ideas are linked together in that way. And as part of this discussion for this chapter, we're going to be tiptoeing very quietly into an area called thermodynamics. We're not going to spend a lot of time there, but there are some laws. There are 3 laws of thermodynamics in total. We focus primarily on 2, but I'll also introduce you to the 3rd one, because the 3rd one is kind of implied by the first 2. And it's probably important that you recognize that the 3rd law exists, because it is extremely obvious to any of us who are alive and paying attention to the world around us. But for reasons which I don't fully understand, the textbook doesn't actually talk about the 3rd law of thermodynamics, yet they imply it in a lot of the discussion. So I'll introduce you to the 3rd law as well, even though it's not mentioned specifically in the textbook. So this is the direction that we're going in. We're going to be talking about energy manipulation. Then we'll talk a little bit about the role of ATP as the energy source for most of what the cell does in terms of work, either directly or indirectly. And then we'll talk about enzymes as the regulators of cell chemical reactions, because this also involves a little bit about energy manipulation. But we do need to understand the role of enzymes, because it is through chemical reactions that living organisms do manipulate energy. And so as we talk about metabolism, we need to also introduce the concept of enzymes and what their effect is on cellular metabolism, or more specifically, on the chemical reactions of cellular metabolism. So these are all the topics that we're going to be talking about today. In this presentation, some fairly heavy-duty discussion about to come your way. I'll try and keep it as simple as I can. There is a little bit of math involved, not that it is technically difficult, and not that you're required to remember the mathematical derivations that I'm going to show you. But it's important that you understand that there is some mathematical support for some of the ideas that I'm going to introduce you to today, because it would be very easy to lose sight of the importance of some of these ideas if you lose sight of the underpinning math behind it. So a little bit of that as well, but nothing really heavy duty as far as the math is concerned, just a derivation of some equations to help us understand a little bit better the nature of the types of chemical reactions that cells participate in. So having set everything up, let's get started so that we can keep this as short as possible. So, as I said, cells are basically a bag of chemical reactions. I've used this analogy many times in the past. And so we really are at this point in our discussion of cells and how they function to require a little bit more sharply focused discussion on the nature of these chemical reactions. What are they there for? What is their primary purpose? And this can be summed up fairly nicely in two statements or a single statement, perhaps, depending on how you want to write this out. So let me bring up a pen. I think I'm going to do this in black, starting off with today, but we may change over to red at some point as well. So when we talk about all of these chemical reactions, and I think I'm going to push this text box a little bit higher out of the way, what we're really talking about is something called metabolism. So let's go back. Let's get the pen up. So what we're really referring to here is metabolism. And metabolism is best described as the sum total of all the chemical reactions in a cell. So if we're talking about cellular, well, let's expand this a little bit and just say organism. Because there are two levels at which we can look at metabolism. We can talk about metabolism of a cell, or we can talk about metabolism of an organism. But irrespective of where we apply the term, metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions in a cell or an organism. So when we start thinking about all of these chemical reactions that are going on, and as the note says here, thousands upon thousands of chemical reactions, even in a simple single-celled organism, say a bacterial cell, there are still thousands upon thousands of chemical reactions occurring every minute. It is very much a hotbed of chemical reactions, a bag full of chemical reactions occurring in water primarily. And so once we start thinking in terms of chemical reactions, we need to start thinking in terms of metabolism. And then we need to start recognizing that metabolism basically consists of two different types of chemical reactions. So moving on to the next slide, where we're going to start addressing this. So we've talked about here the fact that metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions. And I've got that restated here in the slide. And so when we start thinking in terms of the chemical reactions, we also need to start thinking in terms of metabolic pathways. And there is a reason for this. So metabolic pathways they exist because any chemical reaction in isolation, and that's the key here, in isolation. So if you have a single chemical reaction running in isolation, not tied into any metabolic pathway, they'll eventually reach equilibrium. Now, we've talked about equilibrium before, so this is not a new concept. And you should remember that equilibrium means the rate of movement in one direction equals the rate of movement in the opposite direction. And this is true for chemical reactions just as well as it is for any other system that we could talk about where equilibrium is a possibility. Chemical reactions also reach equilibrium if left to their own devices. So if you took a chemical reaction and allowed it to take place within a test tube, it would eventually reach equilibrium, because that is the fate of every chemical reaction to reach equilibrium. The problem with equilibrium for organisms is that there is no net gain or loss or release of energy, because if energy is released by the chemical reaction functioning in one direction, there is an implication and there is a necessity for an input of energy to drive the chemical reaction in the opposite direction. So given that at equilibrium, the rate in one direction is equal to the rate in the other direction, the amount of energy that is released in the forward direction, say, is going to be equal to the amount of energy required to go back in the opposite direction. And so the amount of energy released in the forward direction cancels out, or is cancelled out, by the amount of energy required to go in the reverse direction. In other words, equilibrium represents no net benefit to the cell. And a really nice way of thinking about chemical equilibrium, if you want a chemical way of thinking about chemical equilibrium, or if you want a real world way, let's put it this way, a real world way of thinking about chemical equilibrium, that's death. When the chemical reactions in a cell reach equilibrium, when all of them reach chemical equilibrium, and there's no net energy change as a consequence of the reactions being at equilibrium, that cell is dead. And the same is true for any organism. So as you're going to learn along the way, cells work very, very hard to avoid chemical equilibrium, because reaching chemical equilibrium is the equivalent of death. It is death as far as cells are concerned, as far as organisms are concerned. So having a single chemical reaction that has the capacity to reach equilibrium and will reach equilibrium is of no net benefit to the cell. So the only way to really avoid this is to establish metabolic pathways. And here's the reason why. So let me move the box a little bit higher again to get it out of the way so that I can do some scribbling underneath. So if we have reaction one functioning in isolation, and I think I'm going to change this to red. So let me pull it up and change the color. So if the chemical reaction going forwards is energy releasing, then the reaction going backwards in the reverse direction would be energy requiring. And the reason why it can run backwards is because B is sitting here, providing the opportunity to be converted back to A again. And this is why a chemical reaction in isolation will always reach equilibrium. The reactants on this side, we know that these are the reactants. This is nothing new, we've talked about this before, are converted to the products. Again, nothing new here. But the reason why the chemical reaction can run in the reverse direction and eventually reach equilibrium is because the products are sitting there with the opportunity to be converted back to the starting reactants, which is what is implied in equilibrium. You've got a chemical reaction going forwards, turning the reactants into products, but you have a reverse reaction that takes those products and turns them back into the reactants again. Hence, it reaches equilibrium. So how do you stop the reaction from reaching equilibrium? Well, given that it is the availability of B to be turned back to A that allows it to reach equilibrium, the answer is remove B. And so to remove B, you have to carry out a second chemical reaction. And so we have a second chemical reaction that converts B to C. But of course, if this reaction was allowed to operate in isolation, C could then be converted back to B, and this reaction could reach equilibrium in its own right. But of course, as C gets converted back to B, B then has the opportunity to be converted back to A. You start to see what the issue is here. So long as these intermediates these series of chemical reactions are available for the reverse reaction, in other words, available to allow each reaction to reach equilibrium, there is always the potential for the back reaction. And in fact, even with the presence of metabolic pathways, those back reactions do still occur at very, very low levels. But by maintaining a metabolic pathway, the general tendency is for everything to move in this direction because of the metabolic pathway. And ultimately, somewhere along the way, one of two things is going to happen. Either you're going to have a chemical reaction that thermodynamically, and there I've used a big term, and we'll talk about what thermodynamics means, but in more detail, but it basically means the study of how energy is manipulated. But at some point, we're either going to encounter a chemical reaction that thermodynamically cannot go in the opposite direction. It's simply not favored because of the thermodynamics that are involved, or the end product is simply going to be finally removed. And if the end product is finally removed in some fashion, then it's not available for the back reactions of the metabolic pathway, or to permit the back reactions of the metabolic pathway. So they're going to be reduced to a very low level, a negligible level. So either way, you either have an energetically unfavorable back reaction, or you have the removal of the final product, which does not favor the back reactions. So you start to see, I hope, what the benefit of a metabolic pathway is. If the forward reactions are the reactions that favor the cell, provide energy, provide products that the cell can utilize in some fashion, then maintaining a metabolic pathway that moves those reactions in the favored directions that the cell wants is to its advantage. It doesn't mean that the reactions cannot run backwards. They can most certainly run backwards, and they almost certainly do at very low levels. But by maintaining the metabolic pathway and maintaining the flow of the sequential products of each reaction into subsequent reactions, you favor the metabolic pathway in a particular direction. But it doesn't necessarily have to move in that direction all the time. And you'll understand why as we start to talk a little bit more about thermodynamics. We start to talk about the laws that govern the way cells manipulate energy, which, by the way, are themselves universal. They are the same laws that govern how energy is manipulated in the universe. These are truly universal laws. So they're kind of important, and they apply to any energy manipulating situation or energy manipulating system that we can envisage or that we could study. So these are kind of important laws, as you'll see. So this is the reason why we have these metabolic pathways. And notice that we're also showing the presence of enzymes. We'll talk a little more about enzymes because enzymes are related to the chemical reactions, and in cells, we recognize that nothing is left to chance. Every chemical reaction has an enzyme that manipulates that or assists in the chemical reaction. That's probably the best term that I can use right now, that it assists in the chemical reaction. You'll get more details and have a better understanding by the time we are finished today as far as your understanding of how enzymes function and their relationship to the chemical reactions that they're involved in. More of that to come a little bit later. So we have all of these metabolic pathways that are recognized in cells. And basically, there are two types of chemical reactions within metabolism. So let me bring this back to black again. So metabolism consists of two types reactions. So the first is called catabolism, catabolic reactions. And these are energy releasing. And these are typically described as breakdown reactions. The other part is called anabolism, or anabolic reactions. And these are energy requiring. And these are typically building reactions. Now, if you want to make a connection back to macromolecules, which you should, by the way. So this is not necessarily a hypothetical discussion. So if you want to cast your mind back to the macromolecules and think in terms of the types of reactions that are involved in the macromolecules, energy releasing catabolic breakdown reactions, well, that would be hydrolysis. So hydrolysis and digestion in general, where we break down the large molecules, those are catabolic reactions. And of course, it would be dehydration reactions. That would be the type of reactions that are energy requiring, because there you're building the macromolecules. So another important thing that we're going to be doing this morning is making some of those connections back to things that we've already started talking about in terms of chemical reactions involving the macromolecules, because ultimately we want to be able to apply all of this information to the next two chapters that we're going to be looking at, chapters 9 and 10, that cover cell respiration and photosynthesis, because those two chapters together represent the culmination of our discussion of cellular chemistry. And we are going to need to bring to those discussions of those two chapters everything that you've learned from chapter 2 onwards, including this chapter. In fact, that's the reason why we've been doing these chapters, so that we can address chapters 9 and 10 from a solid foundation of background information about cellular chemistry, because cell respiration and photosynthesis represent the two most important metabolic pathways in cells. And if you have been paying attention to some of the things that I've been talking about in some of the previous presentations, you ought to begin to understand why those two processes are so central. More today, and obviously more over the upcoming two presentations on chapters 9 and 10 as we dig deeper into those. So we've got the information here, but I've already laid that out for you on the previous slide, so we can just keep moving here. So when we start thinking in terms of energy, as I said before, energy is best defined as that which has the capacity to cause change. So let's put that in here. Energy is that which has the capacity to cause change. Work is change. So energy is required do work. So this is the very most fundamental idea that we can propose here with respect to energy and its relationship to work, and by extension, its relationship to our understanding of cells. We know cells do work. Work is change. Therefore, energy has to be involved because energy is what provides the capacity to cause that change. So when we start thinking in terms of energy, there are two types of energy that are essential to cells, and you're probably familiar with these. In fact, these are the two types of energy that are essential for any energy manipulating machine, including a cell, including an organism. We are best thought of as chemical machines, driven by energy that is manipulated through chemical reactions. And we will make that connection in an upcoming slide where I've got some pictures that I always like to talk about whenever we get into this section. And hopefully I'll be able to make the connections for you by showing you a couple of examples where it's really obvious where the two types of energy are, and then talking about a chemical system that you're all familiar with that basically ties everything together in a way that we can start to see the parallel to what we do as organisms. But first, the discussion of the two types of energy. So you can see them named here, potential energy and kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is the one that we focus on when we think in terms of work, because it is the energy of motion and it is the energy of work. So when things are in motion, work can be performed. Kinetic energy is the key to being able to carry out work. But potential energy is the energy that is available for conversion to kinetic energy in order for work to be done. So how can we see an example of that? So I've got in my fingers right now a pen, and you can see it there. And I'm holding it above the desk that I'm sitting at as I record this presentation. And of course, you know what's going to happen if I let go of the pen. It's going to fall. And there's a simple reason why, because it's sitting in a gravity field. It's being pulled on by the Earth's gravity. And if I let it go, it's going to fall. But right now I'm holding it in place. So it has the capacity to change its position. It can fall downwards, but right now I'm preventing it from doing that. So while it has the capacity to do that, while it has the potential to fall, and there's the key word, it does have energy. It has energy which we refer to as potential energy, because it has the potential to cause the pen to change its position, to fall to the desk. But it's not falling. So it only has the potential to fall. So it has potential energy. It has the capacity to change its position. And so long as it has the capacity to change its position, it has potential energy. Now, I'm going to let it fall. So let me shift the computer a little bit so it doesn't fall onto the computer. And you'll hear it when it hits the table. So you heard it hit the table. So you know I let it fall. It's now sitting on the desk. And sitting on the desk, it can no longer fall any further. So it's lost the potential energy that it had when it was sitting in my fingers up here, because it's fallen to the desk. So all of that potential energy has now gone. It's been used up in some fashion. So what happened to that potential energy? Well, as soon as the pen started moving, the potential energy was being converted to the energy of motion, kinetic energy, and therefore it could do work. And you actually heard the pen do work because you heard sound. And sound is compression waves in air. And something had to happen to compress the air in order for it to make compression waves that you detected as sound. And clearly the pen hitting the desk was what did that, because the sound that you heard was the sound of the pen hitting the desk. So what that tells us is that some of the kinetic energy of the falling pen was converted into sound energy that we heard in our ears, the clunk of the pen hitting the table. And this is the important thing that we need to understand about energy as we start to delve into thermodynamics. We can change the type of energy that we have available. And this is a very, very important concept. It actually lies at the heart of one of the two laws of thermodynamics that I'm about to introduce you to. And it's one that most people have heard. And it does state that energy can be changed from one form to another. That is perfectly legitimate. And in fact, if that wasn't possible, we'd all be dead and the universe wouldn't be functioning. It is the ability to change energy from one form to another that allows work to be done, that allows us to be alive, not dead, that allows the universe to keep functioning. So this is kind of an important idea, as you might guess. This is a truly universal idea that we really need to pay attention to. So now we have an idea of the two different types of energy that are important to cells, and the fact that we do need to have available to us some potential energy, that has the capacity to do work, that has the potential to cause change, because it is that energy and its conversion to kinetic energy that is going to allow us to do work, because we need kinetic energy to do work. And energy, as you're about to discover, does not just magically disappear. And again, that's built into some of these laws of thermodynamics that we need to delve into. So this is just talking about what we've been, or just outlining again, what we've just been talking about with the falling pen and movement. So you can take a look at that. So here are the pictures that I want to look at before we delve into the laws. Here are the pictures that I want to look at. So we, in the interest of time, we won't talk about the water behind the dam, although it's a really good analogy for the way in which cells do some of their energy manipulations. And maybe we'll touch on it a little bit, but I really do want to focus primarily on the sled to start off with, but then we want to talk about the car as well. So let's talk about the sled. So here you can see a young man sitting on a big slab of concrete that is sliding down a concrete slab. This is how you go sledding in summer, apparently. Now, the fact that the sled is moving tells us something. If it's moving, it must have kinetic energy, the energy of motion. But where did that motion come from? Well, we know that at some point the sled was sitting on the top of the hill that this track is built on. And if it's sitting at the top of the hill, it's subject to the pull of gravity. It wants to go downhill. It wants to slide down because that's what things do. We know that things go downhill. So sitting at the top of the hill, sitting at the top of the track, that sled with the, and let's assume that the young man was sitting on it at the top of the hill, which obviously he must have been at some point. But he's sitting on top of the sleds, sitting at the top of the hill. It's not moving yet, but we know that the force of gravity will ultimately pull it down the hill. It's above the surface of the earth. It's sitting up at the top of the hill, like the pen being held by my fingers above the desk. So it must have potential energy. As it begins to slide down the hill, just as the potential energy of the pen is converted to kinetic energy as it starts to fall, so the sled, as it starts to slide down the track, is converting the potential energy at the top of the hill that contained at the top of the hill into kinetic energy. In fact, the only source of energy that this sled had sitting at the top of the hill was its potential energy, just as the only energy that this pen has is the potential energy that it has because I'm holding it above the desk. And that's an important idea to understand. Every system, whether it be a sled sitting at the top of the hill, a pen being held in fingers, or any other system that can manipulate energy, must have available to it potential energy. But it can only ever have a fixed amount of potential energy. The sled sitting at the top of the hill has potential energy, but it has a fixed amount of potential energy because of its height above the ground, because of its position on the top of the hill. The pen has a fixed amount of potential energy because of the height that I'm holding it above the desk. It is a function of the distance that the pen can fall or the sled can slide down the hill that determines how much potential energy it has. It can never have any more than the potential energy because of its position. So as it starts to slide down the hill, as the pen starts to fall, that potential energy is going to be converted to kinetic energy, energy of motion, and that's going to permit work to be done. The question then becomes, as this conversion takes place, is it perfect? Is all of the potential energy of the sled sitting at the top of the hill, or all the potential energy of the pen being held above the desk, going to be converted perfectly to kinetic energy as the pen falls, as the sled slides down the hill? Well, excuse me. The answer to that is complicated, but the short answer is no, this conversion is not perfect. The question then becomes, how can we demonstrate that it's not perfect? Well, as far as the pen is concerned, it's a little bit difficult to talk about that. But as far as the sled is concerned, it's a little bit easier to do a mind exercise that illustrates that this is the case. So if the energy of motion is the kinetic energy, then to get a feel for how much kinetic energy the sled actually has, all we need to know is to measure how fast it's going. And if the potential energy is going to be perfectly converted to kinetic energy, then we can actually calculate the amount of potential energy it has. It's not a difficult calculation. It can be done. And we can then measure the speed of the sled at its fastest point, which is obviously going to be near the bottom of the hill. That's when it's going to have its fastest velocity, its fastest motion. And based on the motion of the sled, we can calculate how much kinetic energy it has. Again, it's not a difficult calculation. And that would allow us then to compare the amount of potential energy the sled had at the top and the amount of kinetic energy it has as it slides out the bottom of the track at the bottom, where arguably it should be moving at its fastest velocity. And if we compare those numbers, the first thing that we're going to notice is those numbers are not identical. The amount of kinetic energy at the bottom is less than the amount of potential energy at the top. So the numbers are not deceiving, the numbers are not inaccurate, there really is a loss of energy. So where did that missing energy go? Well, you ought to be able to figure out one already because of what happens when the pen hits the table. It makes a sound. And this sled is anything but quiet as it goes down the hill. It's making sound. And to make sound is work because you're changing the air. You're creating compression waves in the air. You're doing work to compress the air. And if work is being carried out, energy is involved. But if the sled is making the sound, then it is the sled's energy that must be doing the work of making the sound. And the only energy that the sled had was the potential energy that it had at the top of the hill. So it stands to reason that some of that potential energy must be being diverted to make sound and not to make the sled go faster. So we have lost some of the potential energy to sound rather than to kinetic energy. Then if you think about this for just a moment, you'll know that there is a rubbing between the sled and the track. And we understand that rubbing to be the same sort of rubbing that happens when we rub our hands together. We call it friction. And when we rub our hands together, we're actually overcoming friction, that resistive force that resists the motion. And if you want to overcome a force, well, that's work. And work, of course, implies use of energy. So when we rub our hands together to overcome the friction between our hands, we're using our own cellular energy to do that through our muscles. But some of that energy is being released as heat. In fact, we rub our hands together to generate that heat. But it's taking some of the kinetic energy of our hands in motion, or the potential energy of our muscles, in overcoming that friction. And in overcoming that friction, some of the energy is released as heat energy. And that's the same thing that's going to happen with this sled. The two surfaces are rubbing against each other. That means there is instantly going to be friction. In order for the sled to keep sliding, it has to overcome that friction. And that means it's got to do work, but the only energy that's available in the sled to do the work of overcoming friction is the potential energy of the sled that it had at the top of the hill. So that means that some of the potential energy is now being diverted and will ultimately be lost as heat. And of course, if you've ever slid down a playground slide, you know that when you slide down the playground slide, your butt gets hot as you slide down because you're overcoming the friction between your butt and the slide. And obviously heat is being generated. And you're familiar with that idea. It's not a mystery. We've all experienced that. But the point here is, again, we've seen this diversion of some of the potential energy to something other than the kinetic energy of the sled. So whenever we do these conversions of potential energy to kinetic energy in order to get work done, it appears that some of that energy is diverted to something other than being available to do work. It's being converted to other forms of energy that are not kinetic energy and therefore are not available to do work. And that's, again, a universal principle. We could talk about the water falling down the dam or falling through the pipes through the dam. This is a way of generating energy. The idea is very much the same. And the water has to rub against pipes. There's some friction. Energy is going to be lost there. There's the roaring sound of the water. Energy is going to be lost there. If it's being used to generate electricity by driving a turbine, there's going to be friction in the turbine. We can go on and on. Once you start applying this idea of diverting energy away, it becomes very easy to find areas where the energy can be diverted away from simple motion. The kinetic energy of motion, the kinetic energy of work, or the energy of work. So this is built into this notion of converting potential energy to kinetic energy in order to be able to do work. Some of the energy is going to be diverted away into other forms of energy that are not effective for doing work and are not available for doing work. But then we have to ask ourselves a second question. If this conversion is not perfect, is there an actual loss of energy? Does some of the energy simply disappear? Or if it is possible to determine how much potential energy the sled has at the top, which we are able to do, it's as I said, a very simple mathematical calculation. If we then measure the amount of heat energy that's released, the amount of sound energy that's released, the amount of kinetic energy that is produced as the sled slides down the hill, if we take into account any other type of energy that might be generated as the sled goes down the hill, I mean, sparks, light, things like that. There are a number of other things that we could get into. But if we could measure all of the energy that the sled generates from the potential energy that it had at the top of the hill, would they all add up to the amount of energy that the sled had at the top of the hill? And the short answer to that question is yes, absolutely. In spite of the fact that some of the energy is being diverted away into other forms of energy that specifically do not represent kinetic energy and therefore cannot be used to do work, none of the energy actually disappears. All of the potential energy can be accounted for, not only in the form of the kinetic energy of the sled going down the hill, but in all the other types of energy that are not kinetic energy that are produced as a consequence of the sled going down the hill. In other words, while the energy is converted into other forms other than kinetic energy, it never actually goes away. It's just converted into other forms. And the sum total of all the energy that's released as the sled goes down the hill does add up to the original potential energy that it had at the top. And by the way, the fact that the sled is moving down the hill means that it is carrying some of that potential energy down the hill. So the sled represents a source of moving energy. The energy is being moved from one place to another. Also a very important concept. So we could, as I said, talk at length about the water going through the dam. But what I really want to do now is come to the picture of the car. Because it's really in the car and the source of energy for the car that helps us understand how cellular organisms, or how organisms are chemical machines, because the car is a chemical machine itself. And the chemical reactions that it carries out are not that dissimilar from what cells carry out. It takes a fuel, we call it gasoline, and it is burnt in the presence of oxygen. And out of the tailpipe comes primarily carbon dioxide and water. And when we think about cellular respiration, and we think about it in great detail in the next chapter, what you're going to discover is that we take in a fuel, glucose, we combine it with oxygen in a series of chemical reactions. So it looks a whole lot like a burning reaction, which is what's going on in the car engine. And out of the quote unquote exhaust pipe of cellular respiration comes carbon dioxide and water. So the chemistry of a car sounds a whole lot like the chemistry of a cell. Different types of molecules, but the basic idea of combining organic molecules, because gasoline is hydrocarbons, octane and other hydrocarbons, with oxygen in a quote unquote burning reaction and producing carbon dioxide and oxygen, carbon dioxide and water with a release of energy, the parallels are pretty good. So the question then becomes, where is the potential energy that the car is utilizing to get access to kinetic energy, for work and motion to move the car down the road? And the answer becomes really obvious. It's got to be the gasoline. It's got to be the hydrocarbons in the gasoline. And now we reach a very important idea. Chemicals contain potential energy. All molecules contain a certain amount of potential energy. Just like the sled had potential energy sitting at the top of the hill, just as the water behind the dam has potential energy because of its ability to fall downhill. So molecules contain potential energy as well. And you can release that potential energy, or at least some of it, as kinetic energy by the way that you manipulate the molecules in the chemical reactions. And in fact, we call the potential energy of molecules chemical potential energy. It's right there. So let's put this in here and just say all molecules contain chemical potential energy, and chemical reactions and this is in fact how the car extracts chemical potential energy out of the gasoline to convert it into kinetic energy that moves the car down the road. So we combine the fuel with oxygen in the cylinder, apply a spark to it, which sets it on fire, and it's a miniature explosion. That miniature explosion, as the gas expands, which is what an explosion is, drives the piston down the cylinder, but the piston is connected to a camshaft, and that camshaft starts to rotate, or crankshaft starts to rotate. The crankshaft is itself connected to the transmission, and so the transmission and the gears inside the transmission start to rotate. That is in turn connected to the drive shaft, which is connected to the axles, which are connected to the wheels, and the wheels on the bus go round and round, and the people on the bus go up and down. You've heard the song. You know what it's all about. But this is in fact how you get the car to drive down the road. You take the chemical potential energy of the gasoline and you extract some of it as kinetic energy that ultimately moves the car down the road. The unfortunate part about all of this is that it's not terribly efficient. Previously, I would use the number of around 25% efficiency, meaning about 25% of the energy in the gasoline actually winds up as kinetic energy moving the car down the road. The other 75%, vast majority of it is released as heat. This is the reason why you have the radiator sitting at the front of the engine bay to take all of that excess heat energy out of the engine so that the metal doesn't melt and it turns into a pool of molten metal at the bottom of the under the car, or that the engine seizes because it just gets too hot. The way we burn gasoline in our car engines is not terribly chemically efficient. It needs to be burnt at way higher temperatures to extract all of the available energy, but our engine technology simply won't support that. We have got better. We now talk in terms of about 30% efficiency in terms of energy extraction, maybe 35% in some of the really modern cars. In a Formula One race car these days, they say that they're getting about a 70% efficiency because of the technology that they've incorporated to extract as much energy out of burning gasoline as possible. So it is possible to do significantly better even with our current technology. But if you really want the real world consequence of all of this, next time you fill up your car, for every $10 of gasoline that you put in your gas tank, just bear in mind you're about to set fire to $7.50, well, let's say $7, let's be generous. Now you're about to set fire to $7 of that. So you could take $7 out of your wallet and just set it on fire, because that's in essence what you're about to do as you run the gasoline through your car. Gets a little bit discouraging when you think about it that way. The good news is that we as chemical organisms, as chemical machines, are significantly, well, somewhat more efficient, let's say, than our cars. We run at around 40 to 42% efficiency, somewhere in that order, meaning about 40%, maybe 42% of the energy that we take in the form of the food that we eat actually gets utilized for the cellular work that we need to do to maintain ourselves as a living organism and to get the work done that we need to get done to stay alive day by day. Where does the remainder of that energy go? Heat. I'm sitting in a rather small room here in my office in my residence. And even though I've got the air conditioning running and a fan circulating, you can see the fan circulating behind me, it's got rather warm here in this room. Why? Because I'm here. I'm radiating heat energy, and unfortunately this room is on a second floor and it has a window space that allows some heat energy in, so it doesn't get cooled very, very efficiently. But I'm not helping the matter by sitting here. If I was to leave the room and close the door, the room would get cooler fairly quickly. It is my presence that creates part of the problem. In fact, that's why we air condition the buildings. It's not because the buildings necessarily are going to get terribly warm. It's because our presence in them is going to create an extra heat load that needs to be removed if we want to keep the buildings cool. But that's again because as we do our manipulations, as we convert the chemical potential energy of the food that we take in into the kinetic energy that we need to do work, it's not a terribly efficient process, and the vast majority of the energy that comes in is released simply as heat energy. And ultimately, in fact, all of the energy that we take in, with a small amount of exception, is ultimately going to be released as heat energy. And the problem for us as an organism is that heat energy is not a viable source of energy to do work. In some systems, heat energy can be used to do work. So when you heat up water, we talked about the properties of water. When you heat up water, you know that what happens is that the temperature rises, but hopefully you remember the temperature is simply a way of measuring the average kinetic energy of the water molecules in the water. So as you heat the water, you're actually increasing the kinetic energy of the water molecules. You're causing change, you're doing work, and you're using heat energy to do it. So heat energy can be used as a source of energy for work, but not for organisms. Not for organisms. So that means, as part of understanding how organisms work, we need to take that into account. And that's why we need to discuss enzymes a little bit later in this presentation, because enzymes are the solution to that problem, as you'll see. So, having dispensed with the discussion of some examples of energy manipulations and talked about what's going on as that energy is manipulated, let's now formalize this by stating the laws of thermodynamics. So the first law is sometimes referred to as the law of energy conservation. You have probably heard the first part of it that says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Most people have heard that. But there is an addition to that, and I'll write that in here. I don't need to. It's sitting there. I forgot how I'd written this in here. So let me bring up the eraser for a minute. It's not going to recognize. Yeah, now hopefully I can erase. Yeah, there we go. So I've actually got it in here. I forgot that I didn't read the note carefully enough. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but it can be transferred or transformed. And we've seen that. Think about the sled again. It converted its potential energy to kinetic energy as it slid down the hill. And as it's sliding down the hill, it's transferring energy from one location to another. But this is not an odd thing. What we need to add here is a note about these laws of thermodynamics. So the laws of thermodynamics describes what happens in a closed system. That is the amount of energy in the system is fixed and energy can neither enter or leave the system. So this is very important to understand. This is something that is often left out in the discussion of the laws of thermodynamics. They all describe what is referred or apply to what is referred to as a closed system. Now, as you'll see in a couple of moments, we are not closed systems, which is a good thing. But it doesn't mean that the laws of thermodynamics don't apply. They still do apply, but the formal description that the laws of thermodynamics are referring to is a closed system, but they are equally applicable to an open system, as you'll see. So the first law says that in a closed system, the amount of energy is fixed. There's no energy in, no energy out. Energy can't be created. It can't be destroyed. So the amount of energy is fixed, but while it can't be created and it can't be destroyed, you can change it from one form to another. You can move it from one location to another. That's the first law, the law of energy conservation. Perfectly describes what we've seen going on in the sled. But it's the second law and we've also seen the second law working with the sled and also with the car, that is the one that really hurts, because it says that in a closed system where these transformations are occurring, over time, the energy is lost in such a way that it can no longer be used for work. It is released as a full, basically it says that every time you do these transformations, some of the energy is going to be lost in a form that can't be used for work. It's going to be diverted away. And we saw that with the sled. We saw that heat energy was being produced. Sound energy was being produced. They're not kinetic energy. Some of the energy is being lost. And that's basically what the second law is saying. It's saying that the energy is being lost, but we give it a particular name. We call it entropy. It is the energy that is associated with disorder. So as we do transformations, as we do transferals of energy, some of the energy is always going to be diverted away and converted to forms that are not kinetic energy, cannot be used for work. For organisms and for a lot of systems, the energy of entropy, the energy of disorder, is heat energy. Not always, but for a lot of systems it is. And in fact, you can see the connection of heat to disorder by, again, looking at water. So cast your mind back to chapter 3 and remember the 3 states of water: solid, liquid, gas. And when you look at the solid form of water, you've got water molecules locked into a crystal structure, a highly regulated, highly structured form, very ordered. And so you have a low level of disorder, you have a low level of entropy, but the temperature is really low as well. As you start to heat the ice up, it melts into water, and the water molecules are now free to start moving around. And they're not as highly ordered anymore. They're becoming more disordered. But you're getting that increase in disorder by increasing the temperature. And if you want to think about water in its most disordered state, well, you think about water in its gaseous state, where the water molecules are no longer even interacting with each other through hydrogen bonds. They're completely divorced from each other. And they're completely disordered. But that happens at a much higher temperature still. So we also have to bear in mind that entropy has a connection to temperature. And that is built into the mathematics of entropy and energy. When we take a look at the reaction that, or the equation, sorry, not reaction, the equation that describes energy availability, you're going to see a temperature term associated with the temperature term for entropy or disorder. Now, while this is applying to a closed system, in terms of a closed system, it implies that eventually, because every time you do these transformations or transferals, you're going to be diverting energy away to disorder energy, to entropy. In a closed system, that means that eventually you're going to run out of energy, because remember, the first law says in a closed system, the amount of energy is fixed. No more energy in, no energy in, no energy out. The second law says in that closed system where the amount of energy is fixed, eventually you must run out of energy, because as you utilize the energy in some fashion to do work, you're also going to be increasing entropy, and eventually all the energy is going to be in the form of entropy energy, which for most things is heat. That doesn't sound good. It certainly doesn't sound good for the universe, because the implication there is, remember, these are universal laws, and therefore the universe must obey these laws as well. And that means that eventually the universe must run out of energy, because as best we can tell, it is finite. There is an edge to the universe somewhere. We don't know exactly where, but we know that we believe don't know, we believe that there is an edge to the universe, that it is a closed system, which means that the energy that's in the universe is fixed, which means it must be following these same laws. That means the entropy must be increasing. Therefore, eventually the universe runs out of useful energy, and the end story of that is the universe dies. It thermodynamically dies, let's put it that way. And cosmologists, the people who study these things, have done the calculations, and they figure the universe is going to run out of energy somewhere around 100 trillion years from now. Yes, an inordinately long period of time. We don't have to run out and say the universe is dying, sort of thing. And it's quite likely that humans as a species are probably not going to be around 100 trillion years from now to see the end of the universe, which is probably a good thing anyway. But if we were to see the end of the universe, the cosmologists tell us that when the last energy manipulations cease, the universe will be a cold, cold, cold place. Probably. It will be thermodynamically dead. There'll be no more atoms moving. There'll be no more vibrations, nothing. It will be thermodynamically dead. Okay, now that we've killed off the universe, let's talk about the implication for what the second law tells us about organisms. It means that if we want to manipulate energy to stay alive, we have to take into account not just the first law, but the second law. The first law says that if we are to function as a closed system, we can manipulate energy. We just can't make new energy out of nothing, and we can't make energy go away. The second law says that if you are a closed system, eventually you must run out of energy. So let's talk about those implications for organisms. If you are a closed system as an organism, no energy in, no energy out, it's very easy to imagine how that could happen. Because as an organism, you get your energy by eating food. So if you stopped eating food, we all know what's going to happen eventually. After about 70 days or thereabouts, you're going to drop dead. Because you'll run out of energy. Your body will have digested all its contents, extracted the maximum amount of energy that it can, been as efficient as it can, but because you haven't provided it with any new sources of energy, eventually it's going to run out and you will die. It takes about 3 months, approximately. In fact, for those of you who are going into the health sciences, you'll hear me refer to something called the triple threes. And you may learn about the triple threes in some of your health science classes somewhere along the way. The triple three goes like this. You can live for about 3 minutes without oxygen. You can live for about 3 days without water. You can live for about 3 months without food. So oxygen is the most limiting of your requirements. Water comes next, and then food is the least limiting, but eventually you will reach the limit if you don't take in food after around 3 months or thereabouts. About 70 days, 70 to 80 days is what is generally considered to be about how long you can exist without taking any new sources of calories to food. So that means we simply can't function as a closed system in terms of stopping energy from coming in. We need to constantly take in food. That's an implication of the first and second law. We can't function as a closed system by preventing energy in. But it goes even further than that, because we can't function as a closed system in terms of energy out. We have to let energy out, because remember again, the vast majority of energy that is liberated via chemical reactions that make the kinetic energy available for doing our work is in the form of heat. And we know that heat is not a viable source of energy for organisms. In fact, if we raise the temperature of an organism too much, in our case from around 37 degrees Celsius to approximately 45 degrees Celsius, that becomes lethal. So we've got a narrow window of opportunity in which to raise the temperature of our bodies without it causing any significant damage. But at around 45 degrees Celsius, that becomes lethal. So we really do need to radiate out all of that heat energy. So we simply can't function as a closed system. We have to allow energy in the form of food. We have to allow energy out in the form of the heat energy that needs to be radiated out. So we can't be a closed system. Does that then mean that the first and the second law don't apply to us? Absolutely not, because we haven't even talked about the third law. The third law is an extension of the second law, and it basically says everything runs downhill. Let me clean that up. That's the third law, but that's basically a summary of what the third law says. It says it a little bit more elegantly, but that's what it says. Everything runs downhill, which is kind of implied by the second law, but not specifically implied by the second law. The second law simply says that disorder increases over time. The third law says everything goes downhill. That's the third law implication. So we can't function as a closed system as an organism, but that doesn't mean that these laws don't apply to us, given that they were originally descriptions of what happens in a closed system, because of the notion that if you manipulate energy in one location, you do so at the expense of entropy in another location. So how can I illustrate this? Well, I want you to imagine your bedroom. Maybe you're sitting in your bedroom right now. Just take a look around. How ordered is that? In other words, how organized and ordered is that? Is everything in its right place? No dust, no dirt, everything spick and span clean? Yeah, I can just hear the cringes from here. You know it's not. So if you want it to be ordered, if you want it to be perfectly ordered and organized, there's one thing that you're going to have to do. You're going to have to do work. And remember, work requires energy. So in order to create order, you need to do work, which means you need to do energy. So let's make the commitment to get the bedroom organized. So you make that commitment. You say, I want my bedroom to be perfectly ordered and organized. I'm going to clean it, going to put everything back in its place. Everything's going to be perfect. And I want to keep it that way. So I'm just simply going to close the door and never go back in there again because I want it to stay perfect. And we all know that that's not going to work either, because if we don't go in there and keep cleaning, dust is going to build up and immediately it's no longer perfect again. So the implication of the second law is that not only do you have to do work to maintain order or to create order, you have to do work to maintain order. Okay, so you say, fine, I can live with that. So I'll just keep doing the work in my bedroom. I'm just going to focus on my bedroom because I want it to be the perfect room. And I'm just going to expend all my energy keeping my bedroom perfectly in order. But of course, you know that that's really not going to work either, because if you focus just on your bedroom, we all know that the rest of the house is going to get dirty over time. And that's what is meant by, if you maintain order in one location, you do so at the expense of disorder or entropy somewhere else. And it's entropy within the universe. One of the things that I have often played with with classes is this idea that our very existence is killing the universe. Now, that's kind of an extreme statement to make, but it is nonetheless somewhat true, because as energy manipulating machines, we are turning energy into forms that for us are no longer useful. They may be useful elsewhere in the universe, but ultimately, remember, we are doing so at the expense of disorder elsewhere. So how do we contribute to disorder elsewhere? Well, when you get your food, you get it from other living organisms. And in order to get the food from those living organisms, you have to kill them. That's disorder, right? the chemical reactions of those organisms reach equilibrium, and thermodynamically that's disorder. Because thermodynamically, order is metabolic pathways with a regulated sequence of chemical reactions. When they become thermodynamically disordered, they reach chemical equilibrium. And so the organism that you eat, whether it be a plant or an animal, becomes ultimately disordered. Its entropy increases quite dramatically in order for you to be able to get the energy that you need to maintain your order. So maintaining your order is done at the expense of chemical disorder of the organisms that you eat, the sources of your food. But of course, we know where the energy of life comes from. And remember, this is true of any organism that eats another organism to get its energy, which is all of them except plants. But plants get their energy from the sun. And the sun itself is becoming disordered over time. It's using up its nuclear fuel, the hydrogen, that it burns by forcing it together under the influence of the sun's extreme gravity to form helium with the release of energy. But over time, that is creating disorder in the sun. And eventually, about 5 billion years from now, so the astronomers tell us, the sun itself will undergo some very dramatic changes over a period of around 100 million years, which will ultimately result in a sun that we would not recognize. That would be small and dense and white, and would be called a neutron star. And it would not provide the energy to maintain the Earth if the Earth was still in existence, because part of the transformation involves the sun swelling up quite dramatically, perhaps even swallowing up the Earth as it swells before it collapses in on itself very, very dramatically in a possible small explosion. The sun is right on the borderline of doing that in terms of its mass. It might go supernova, it might not. It may not be big enough to do that. But nonetheless, the sun is the source of our energy, but it is the source of our energy for life at the expense of its own disorder. And the same is true for stars anywhere in the universe, whether it be in our galaxy or any of the hundreds of billions of galaxies that are present in the visible universe. It's the same basic laws that are still applying. The first, second, and third law are still applying to the universe. And so in order to maintain our order, we do contribute in a very, very, very small way to the overall entropy of the universe, if you want to take it to its extreme. But this is the implication of these laws. Right? We cannot function as a closed system because we do need to let energy in, and we do need to let energy out. So even though the laws apply to a closed system and we're no longer a closed system, that doesn't mean we're off the hook, because in order to maintain the order that we need to maintain by taking in energy, we can only do that at the expense of disorder, of entropy, for those organisms that we utilize as food, which are in turn maintained by the disorder of the sun as the source of energy for life on Earth. Which is the reason why we also have to be very cautious about talking about the laws of thermodynamics and the whole question of whether life could evolve or not. Because some people have argued that the evolution of life can only be done in contradiction to the three laws of thermodynamics. And therefore evolution could not be possible. But this is a misunderstanding of the laws of thermodynamics. Remember, the laws of thermodynamics do not prohibit increasing order. All they say is that if you're going to have an increase in order, you have to have a source of energy to do so, but that energy is going to be collected at the expense of disorder somewhere else. And as the energy from the sun is far more than is necessary to maintain the order of life on Earth, or to account for the increase in order of life on Earth. The evolution of life from simple to complex does not contradict the second laws of the laws of thermodynamics. It's perfectly in line with it. All that is implied by the laws of thermodynamics is that in order for life to evolve increased complexity, it needs a source of energy that can drive that increased evolution of complexity. And the sun is more than capable of providing that energy. In fact, when life first evolved, the sun was far more intense and produced far more energy than it does now in its middle age. So, yeah, you have to bear in mind what the laws are actually saying. Life does not contradict the laws of thermodynamics. In fact, life cannot exist outside of the laws of thermodynamics, as best we can tell. I have said it this way in the past, that life cannot not obey the laws of thermodynamics. It has to operate within the laws of thermodynamics. Once you understand what the laws actually say and what the implications are for organisms, it's quite easy to see how life functions within the framework of the three laws of thermodynamics. So we've been going for a while. Let's take a break. If you've been following along with me and you need to take a bathroom break or get a drink or get a snack, or you want to stop for a while and just let your brain take a rest because there's been some pretty heavy duty stuff here, by all means, put me on pause or turn me off. As I've said before, it doesn't matter. I'll still be here when you come back again, and I won't know whether you've turned me off or not. It's what is your comfort level at this point. Oh, I see I've got a typo here. So here's our concept check question for this break. How does the second law of thermodynamics help explain the diffusion of a substance across a membrane? Cue the Jeopardy music. Okay, so let's talk about this question for a minute. So when we've got a diffusion gradient, remember diffusion occurs when you've got a difference in concentration, high concentration on one side of the membrane, low concentration on the other side of the membrane, which means you've got an ordered system. There's a degree of order there because you've got an artificially high concentration on one side, an artificially low concentration on the other side. There's some order in that. And when you have an ordered system, there's energy in it. And so that ordered system, as the second law and the third law say, is going to run downhill to disorder. And the increase in disorder is the equilibrium level. Just as chemical equilibrium, chemical disorder for organisms can be represented by equilibrium of chemical reactions, so equilibrium in a diffusion gradient also represents an increase in disorder. And so the second law is a perfect way of explaining why molecules diffuse across a membrane from high concentration to low concentration. They're simply going downhill. They're going from a highly ordered system to a more disordered system. They're going from a non-equilibrium to an equilibrium. And so the second law is the perfect explanation of why diffusion is a spontaneous process. So long as you are going from order to disorder, there will be a spontaneous movement of the molecules from an ordered system to a disordered system, from a concentration gradient towards equilibrium. So that's the explanation. Okay, onwards and upwards, talking more about energy manipulation. So a little bit of math now before we get into tying the laws of thermodynamics to the chemical reactions of cells. So there are two types of energy that we can refer to when we think in terms of the chemical potential energy in molecules. So one is referred to as enthalpy, the system's total energy. You can see that here. Let me make sure that I've got this in red. Okay, so the total system, or given its mathematical symbol H, is called enthalpy. So oops, that. So it's somewhat equivalent to potential energy. The chemists would argue that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And it's true, it is a little bit more complicated than that. But for our purposes, we can think of the enthalpy, the total system in, or the total energy in a system, like a chemical, is the equivalent of the chemical potential energy. Maybe I should put that up here. So somewhat equivalent to chemical potential energy. Then the other type of energy is the energy tied up in disorder, the entropy energy, which we give the symbol S. Then there is a third type of energy that we need to take into account here, and that's the one that's given the chemical, the symbol G. That is the free energy. That is the energy in the system that is not the entropy energy, not the energy of disorder. It is free because it's available to do work. That's where the term, that's what the term free means here. It's not tied up in anything else. So it's available to do work. It's free. It's available to do work. Doesn't mean it doesn't cost anything. Energy always has a cost associated with it. But the free here simply means that it is available to do work. So when we want to represent this mathematically, we say that H, total energy in the system, is equal to the free energy, the amount of energy that's available to do work, plus Ts. Now remember, S is the energy, is the symbol for entropy, the disorder energy. T is for temperature. And remember, I've already given you the example of order and disorder with regard to temperature in water. So this is the reason why there is a temperature term associated with entropy, because entropy is a function of temperature. So the amount of disorder is typically a function of temperature. The lower the temperature, the more order. The higher the temperature, the more disorder, is a general rule of thumb. So H equals G plus Ts. In other words, the total amount of energy in a system, like a molecule, is the amount of free energy plus the amount of energy tied up in disorder, whatever that may be. If we want to think in terms of the free energy, which is the only energy that organisms can use for work, then we rearrange the equation to reflect G, and therefore it becomes G equals H minus Ts. And in other words, the amount of free energy that's available is equal to the total amount of energy minus whatever energy is tied up in entropy. What it's telling us is that not all of the energy of a molecule is available for doing work, or not all of the energy in a system is available to do work, molecules being a system. So one of the issues that we run into is that in terms of free energy, the more unstable something is, the more free energy it has. the more stable it is, the less free energy something has. So if you're moving from something that's unstable to something that is stable, you're moving from a system that has more free energy to a system that has less free energy. And that's an important observation. Remember the diffusion gradient. Are you moving from something that has more stability or less stability? Well, if you've got a diffusion gradient going on, you've got something that is less stable and you're moving towards equilibrium, which is a situation that is more stable. And so you're actually decreasing the overall free energy of the system. And that becomes an important observation when we start thinking in terms of how organisms can extract energy out of systems, as you'll see in some upcoming slides. So this whole notion of free energy starts to become really interesting in terms of thinking about how we can access energy in chemical reactions. Because if we want to extract energy from chemical reactions, we have to think in terms of the free energy available in the molecules. Are those molecules more stable? Are they less stable? Are we moving from a situation where we're going from a more stable molecule to a less stable molecule, or are we going from a less stable molecule to a more stable molecule in the chemical reaction that we're talking about, the chemical reaction that we're focusing on? And basically, when we start thinking about that, we have to recognize that in terms of chemical reactions, it's not the total amount of free energy in a molecule that matters. What really matters is the change in free energy that matters. Erase this and tidy it up a little bit. Oops. Go all the way back here. I think I'm just not going to be able. Yeah, I'm just not going to be able to do that. It's going to keep bouncing me out. Okay. Let me erase this. So let me explain what I'm saying here. If you look at a chemical, you can measure the amount of potential energy that's in there, or the free energy that's in there. When we talk about a food having a certain number of calories, that's a measure of the amount of chemical energy that can be made available from the molecule. You can think of it as its free energy in the food. But what really matters is not the total amount of energy that's in that food molecule. What really matters is how much free energy change is going to occur when that molecule is processed through the chemical reactions of, say, digestion, for instance. Because it's only as we process it and there is a free energy change and energy is released or required, depending on the type of chemical reaction, that really matters. And so when we think in terms of the change in free energy, we use the Greek letter delta, the uppercase version, which looks like a triangle, and we talk about delta G, the change in free energy, which mathematically, using our previous equation, we can write this way: delta G equals delta H minus T delta S. In other words, the change in free energy is equal to the change in overall energy in the system minus the overall change in entropy. But that becomes a little bit tedious for us to understand and in fact, or remember, and in fact, I don't even want you to remember this. The form of the equation that I really want you to remember is this form. Okay, so this is the one to remember. Delta G equals the G of the product minus the G of the reactants. That's basically what this equation is saying. So final state, well, that's the products. Starting state, that's the reactants. So delta G is the G of the products minus the G of reactants. Now, there are three ways in which this might be represented in a chemical reaction. So let me bring this up here. So there's three possibilities. Maybe I should change that to black. So let's take that out and do this in black so it doesn't clash with the arrow. So there are three possibilities. One, G product and G reactant equal to G product is greater than G reactant. And three, G product is less than G reactant. So, of the three circumstances, number one doesn't work for cells. That's chemical equilibrium or thermodynamic equilibrium. And remember, thermodynamic equilibrium, chemical equilibrium, that's a good definition of death. So number one doesn't work for cells. So there are only two possibilities as far as cellular chemical reactions are concerned. The G of the products is greater than the G of the reactants, or the G of the products is less than the G of the reactants. So we can diagram those two circumstances fairly readily. So I'm going to jump over that one for a moment, and I'm going to come back to that slide because that slide's actually a really critical slide for understanding of energetics in cells. So here are the two circumstances. If the reactants have a higher free energy than the products, then the energy flow is downhill. And the slope of this line is a negative slope. And so the value of delta G is negative. Because the delta G is the difference between the energy, the G of the reactants and the G of the products, remember. So it's the G of the products minus the G of the reactants. So it's the difference between the two. And in this case, the difference has a negative value. Delta G is negative. And that tells us that this is energy releasing. And the term we use for this is to say that it is exergonic. If the G of the products is greater than the G of the reactants, then the energy flow is uphill, the slope is positive. So in this case, the delta G itself is positive. These are energy requiring reactions. And the term we use for that is endergonic. Now, if you want to tie that back to metabolism and the two parts of metabolism, and of course we want to do that, energy releasing, well, this would be catabolic. And this would be anabolic. And we could also put in here hydrolysis. And this would be dehydration. So these are the two different types of reactions that cells utilize. We have reactions where the delta G is negative. The reactants have a greater G value than the products, so energy is going to be released, but it has a negative slope. So delta G is negative, energy is released. These are exergonic reactions, which would be either catabolic or hydrolysis reactions. If the products have a greater G value than the reactants, well, you're increasing the amount of G. So delta G is positive. The move is uphill. Delta G is positive, energy requiring. These are endergonic reactions. Energy needs to be supplied. These would be anabolic reactions or dehydration reactions. And what I want to put in here is another note. In cells, exergonic reactions, it's going to be messy. Exergonic reactions are paired with endergonic reactions in order to supply the energy needed for the endergonic reaction. And this is a principle that you're going to see played out over and over again as we do chapters 9 and 10, where you have an endergonic reaction that requires energy in order for it to occur, what is sometimes referred to as a driven reaction. then you're going to pair it with an exergonic reaction that's going to provide the energy necessary to drive the endergonic reaction. This is a very common theme in cellular chemistry. Now, I jumped over a slide that's really important in terms of understanding how cells do things. This slide is unfortunately not found in the textbook anymore for reasons which I don't fully understand. The authors and the editors decided that this diagram should be replaced with one from that features a diving board. I personally prefer the playground slide because I think the playground slide illustrates more nicely how cells manipulate energy, and you're all familiar with the playground slide. Everyone's used one, and it is a perfect representation of cellular energy manipulation and the laws of thermodynamics in action. So when you're sitting at the top of the playground slide, you have potential energy because you have the potential to move. That's not really neat. I'm sorry about that. It's potential energy that's up here. The fact that you have the capacity to move means that you must have potential energy. And realistically, there's any number of ways you could move from here. You could climb down the stairs, you could fall over the side. Ideally, what you want to do is slide down the slide, of course. That's why you climb to the top of the playground slide in the first place. So given that you have the potential to move, you are also unstable. And you have the capacity to do work because you're sitting at the top of the slide. As you slide down, obviously, kinetic energy is being released, and that allows you to do work. When you get to the bottom of the slide and you're seated on the ground at the bottom of the slide, you have zero potential energy because you can't fall anymore. And you also have potential zero kinetic energy because you're not moving. So this is a very stable position because you're not moving anymore. So on the playground slide, you're moving from an area of high potential energy that is less stable and therefore gives you the ability to do work. As you slide down the slide, you're transforming the potential energy to the energy of motion, kinetic energy, and you can do work. Some of the energy is being diverted. You know that your butt gets warm as you slide down a playground slide. So that's the evidence of the second law at work. When you get to the bottom and you're no longer moving, you have no more kinetic energy. But because you can't fall any further when you're at the bottom, you also have zero potential energy. So your work capacity has decreased to essentially zero. You're in a more stable position. If you want to slide, obviously the polite thing to do is to get up and walk around and climb to the top of the slide again and wait your turn. But we all know how we play this game. Because we want to slide, we don't want to stand there waiting our turn. We simply turn around, we climb straight back up the slide itself so we can slide down again. And cells do a similar sort of thing. So in terms of looking at this in its cellular equivalent, sitting at the top of the playground slide is the same as having a diffusion gradient. So here we have a diffusion gradient. You can see we've got all the molecules collected on one side of the separating membrane, a very low concentration on the other side, which we're saying is equivalent to being at the top of the playground slide. So this is an inherently unstable position, but represents a high potential energy. As the molecules now start to move, moving downhill, and we know that the second law is involved here as well as the third law, everything moves downhill. Disorder is increasing. Kinetic energy is released. That allows us to do work. And when we get to the bottom, or we reach the equilibrium condition, remember, This is equivalent to being at the bottom of the playground slide. Zero potential energy, zero kinetic energy. Not a good position for the cells to be in. So their preference is to be somewhere in here. This is where they want to be, sliding down the playground slide. And the only way for them to do that is to simply prevent this diffusion gradient from reaching equilibrium. And the way cells do that is to collect these molecules or whatever it is that's diffusing down the gradient from this side and simply transfer everything back to the top of the gradient again. The same equivalent to you climbing up the playground slide instead of going around and climbing up the stairs again. It just simply takes everything back to the top of the slide again. You could think of it as you walking around climbing up the stairs again if you want to, however it works for you. But you're going to have to move things back to the top of the slide again in order for you've got to stop it from reaching equilibrium. You've got to continue to slide, be in the sliding portion of the playground slide. Now, for cells, this means that you can't commit to making ATP using this system if you're going to use ATP to move everything to the top. Using ATP to make ATP is not a good deal. In fact, it's a zero-sum game. You will eventually run out of energy. And the diffusion gradient is the way in which cells drive the synthesis of ATP, or the vast majority of ATP, as we'll discover in Chapter 9. So it is not worthwhile using ATP to move things to the top if you're simply going to use this diffusion gradient to continue making ATP. Because the second law says that's a zero-sum game, you will eventually run out of ATP. You need an alternative source of energy. And that alternative source of energy is cell respiration. So this is glucose, and this is CO2 and water. And you can see here that glucose is the equivalent of being at the top of the playground slide. So it's an inherently unstable molecule with a lot of potential energy. Now it gets a little bit more complicated than that, and when we talk about enzymes shortly, you'll see why. There is a reason for that. In breaking the glucose down to carbon dioxide and water, that's moving to the bottom of the playground slide. So here we're looking at essentially zero potential energy and zero kinetic energy, which means that in here, kinetic energy is being released. That kinetic energy can do work, and the work that it does is move these molecules from, or whatever it is that's diffusing. In the case of making ATP, it's hydrogen ions, moving it from the bottom of the gradient to the top of the gradient, so it never reaches equilibrium. Never reaches equilibrium. And in a nutshell, what you've got in this diagram is cell respiration. Breakdown of glucose to carbon dioxide and water to release energy to regenerate a hydrogen ion gradient that drives the synthesis of ATP. Now, it gets way more complicated than that, and you'll see that in Chapter 9, and you'll see that as you generate your infographic around Chapter 9 on cellular respiration, which hopefully you've already begun. If you haven't, now would be a good time to start doing so. You can find a description of the assignment in the link in this week's module and in next week's module as well, because it carries over from this week into next week, the production of the infographic, posting and responding to your classmates' infographics. So you might want to check that out if you haven't already. But the whole point here is that this is a way for the cells to manipulate energy via a diffusion gradient and via chemical reactions to its own advantage, making ATP. And this is a really important diagram that you probably want to spend a little bit of time thinking about. Maybe listen to my description again a couple of times so that you are clear on what the significance of the diffusion gradient is in terms of energy manipulation. Look at it in connection to the playground slide, and then think in terms of the chemical reactions of cell respiration, which are illustrated on over here on this side. These are the reactions of cell respiration and how that relates to manipulating energy to make energy available for the reconstitution of the hydrogen ion gradient that makes the ATP. Very, very important idea, series of ideas tied up in what is really a very simple diagram. We'll revisit this multiple times as we talk about cell respiration and photosynthesis, because I'll constantly be asking you, where are we on the playground slide? Where do you think we are on the playground slide? Be constant reference back to that. That's why I like this diagram. So we've talked a lot about equilibrium and the necessity for cells to stay away from equilibrium. The next series of slides just refer to that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because we've done equilibrium in a lot of detail as we've come through these other slides. The only thing that I want to point out is that you can keep things open by having a single step in cells, as you'll see when we talk about cell respiration. There is, in fact, a daisy chain. I like to think of it as a staircase. The book is illustrating it here as a sequence of turbines that allows you to stair-step down through a sequence of events that harvest the energy, in this case of water flowing down, in the case of cells, electrons flowing from a region of high free energy to a region of low free energy. A lot more to discuss with that when we talk about the details in Chapter 9 in the next presentation. So let's take a quick break here. This is going to be, unfortunately, a fairly extensive presentation, so make sure that you're taking breaks along the way. There's a lot of information, unfortunately, tied up in this chapter that takes a little bit to explain, and I'm sorry about that, but there's no easy way of getting around this in terms of understanding how cells manipulate energy so that you can really understand cell respiration and photosynthesis at the level that you really need to. So here's the concept check. And of course, if you want to take a bathroom break, grab a drink, grab a snack, feel free to do so. If you need to go away and give your brain a little bit of a break, by all means do so. But if you're sticking with me, here's our concept check. So you're all familiar with the glow-in-the-dark sticks. You crack them and they start glowing. What you're doing is activating them and you're allowing some chemicals to mix together. So the question is the reaction that creates the glow an exergonic or an endergonic reaction? What do you think? Little Jeopardy music, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so what do we think? Well, the answer is simply to remember that light is itself a form of energy. So if the chemical reaction that is taking place between these chemicals is releasing light, and light is a type of energy, and that's important for our understanding of photosynthesis in a couple of chapters' time, then this chemical reaction is releasing energy in the form of light. That means it must be exergonic because it's releasing energy. So energy can be released from chemical reactions in a number of different forms. It could be in the form of heat. In this case, there's very little heat release, but some chemical reactions release huge amounts of heat, so that's not unusual. But here, energy is being released in the form of light, which is a type of energy that our eyes happen to be sensitive to, which is the reason why we can see it. So, as strange as it may seem, if this is the first time you've ever considered it this way, this is an energy releasing reaction because light itself is a form of energy and it's being released from this chemical reaction. So these are exergonic reactions. So let's talk about ATP for for a moment. ATP is involved in cellular work, and there are three basic types of cellular work: mechanical, transport, and chemical, and ATP can be used to drive all of them. So when we think in terms of cell respiration, as we'll see, a glucose molecule, and I'm going to put a line through this because we now think that this is a little bit different. Our general impression is that it's about 32 to 34 ATP per glucose molecule. So this is the reason why when we talk about cell respiration, we think in terms of glucose, that and the fact that glucose is the primary fuel that our cells prefer to burn. And that it's equivalent to a significant number of ATP molecules. And the reason why it's important is because of the presence of these three phosphate groups on the ATP molecule, or more specifically, the fact that these three phosphate groups are next to each other and they are extremely electronegative. And the covalent bonds, let's clean that up a little bit. So the covalent bonds So this note basically tells you everything that you need to know about why ATP represents a source of energy. You got these three phosphate groups sitting next to each other. They're extremely polar groups, very electronegative. They don't play nice with each other. And that means that the covalent bonds that are holding them together, but particularly the one that's between the second and the third phosphate groups, the one that I've arrowed, is under a lot of stress. Now, if you're under stress, you're unstable. And as we've seen from the playground slide, if you're in an unstable position, that represents a high level of potential energy. So the bond between the second and the third phosphate group, because of the stress that it's under, represents a significant amount of potential energy tied up in that bond. Removing the third phosphate group So if you remove that third phosphate group, you break the covalent bond that's holding this third phosphate group on there. You reduce some of the source of the stress. You've taken away the one of the electronegative groups, and two electronegative groups reduces the strain on the covalent bond, or reduces the overall potential energy, the overall stress on the molecule. And so you're moving from a high potential energy situation to a lower potential energy situation. Of course, if you reduce the amount of potential energy, that implies the release of some of that potential energy as kinetic energy. And so by removing the phosphate group, and specifically removing the phosphate group and transferring it to another molecule, represents the transfer of the energy in the covalent bond that's just been broken. And that's how ATP provides energy for cellular work. We transfer the phosphate group to another molecule. The chemical reaction that's involved is a hydrolysis reaction, so you should be familiar with that. It's the breaking through the addition of water, so it's a typical hydrolysis reaction. And you're going from a high stress to a low stress, from a high potential energy to a lower potential energy situation. So you are releasing energy. So here's an example of a way that you can utilize potential energy or the energy of an ATP molecule to drive a chemical reaction. I'm going to have to move this down here so I can see the top part of the slide. So here's the overall reaction. Glutamic acid, which is an amino acid that we need to get in our diet. It's one of the essential amino acids. Can be converted to the amino acid glutamine by a chemical reaction that occurs in our cells, so long as we have an amine group available to modify the glutamic acid. That amine group will be grabbed from another amino acid. But notice the delta G. The delta G has a positive value. Don't look at the number, just look at the fact that it is positive. Oops. So positive here means that it requires energy. It's endergonic. Use the right term. So the way we get the energy is to transfer the phosphate group from ATP onto the glutamic acid. That increases the free energy of the reactants. So with an increase in the free energy of the reactants, we now go from a reaction that needs to go uphill to a reaction that now can proceed downhill. And now the reaction is favorable. So basically what you've got, if I can diagram this, let me see if I can get this to work. So here's the glutamic acid sitting down here, and this is free energy. The glutamic acid plus the phosphate group is now sitting up here, and now you can go downhill to glutamine instead of having to go from the glutamic acid up to the glutamine. So this is how ATP is used to drive a chemical reaction. It increases the addition of the phosphate group, the addition of the energy from the ATP, increases the free energy on the reactant side of the reaction, which means that instead of having to go uphill, you can now go downhill, but you've got to add in the extra energy in order to be able to do that, and that extra energy comes from ATP. So what's the big deal about ATP? Notice that the delta G for the hydrolysis of ATP is very negative. And it is very exergonic. So it releases the energy or releases energy in the process. Now notice we do have excess energy left over. And this energy is released as heat. Because any energy that's left over from the hydrolysis of ATP cannot be recycled to be reused. It's entropy energy. And so it's released as heat as the entropy energy from the breakdown of the ATP. So this is how ATP can be used to drive a chemical reaction. It can also be used to drive mechanical and transport work. So we talked about active transport when we talked about the sodium potassium pump, when we talked about membranes in the previous presentation. That addition of phosphate to the sodium potassium pump allows us to drive the movement of sodium out of the cell against its gradient and drive the movement of potassium into the cell also against its gradient. But it required the energy from ATP to be able to do that. So that movement, the active transport, must be described as an endergonic process, requires energy from the ATP. We can also use ATP to move things along microtubule frameworks, or to drive a cilium or a flagellum, the motor protein, or to contract a muscle. The motor proteins get phosphorylated. A phosphate group is transferred from ATP to the motor proteins. That provides energy for the motor protein to change shape. When the phosphate is removed, the motor protein reverts back to its normal shape, but that allows then the motor protein to do this. It walks along the microtubule and it carries whatever is attached to it along the microtubule, whether it be a vesicle or whether it simply be an attachment to another microtubule, causing the cilia to bend or the flagella to bend backwards and forwards, or the muscle proteins to pull on each other to contract the muscle cell. It's all about the addition and removal of phosphate to provide energy and to release energy again. You'll learn more about this when you take your A&P classes if you're heading to the nursing program or to our allied health science programs. You'll learn more about that in the A&P classes that you may have to take or will have to take for many of you. So this is, again, how ATP can act as an energy source. So why ATP? What is the big deal about ATP? It's because of this, what is referred to as the ATP cycle. It's the fact that ATP and only ATP can be regenerated by using food directly, by using energy that's directly extracted out of our food. There are other molecules that can provide energy to cellular processes, and you'll encounter a few of them along the way. But they are regenerated using energy sourced from ATP. It is only ATP that is regenerated directly using energy from food. And that's what makes it so important. So you may hear a discussion of many reasons as to why ATP is so important, but it all comes down to just this simple observation. Of all the energy molecules that cells utilize as sources of energy, it is only ATP that can be reconstituted using energy directly extracted from food molecules. None of the other molecules that can provide energy to cellular work can be regenerated that way. They are regenerated using energy derived from ATP molecules. So that's what makes ATP so important. And to make a connection to the real world, one of the reasons why we have the 333s, 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 days without water, 3 months without food, is simply that we contain within our cells probably around 2 to 3 minutes worth of ATP. I've seen a number of different values referenced, but it's approximately 2 to 3 minutes worth of ATP. which is connected to the fact that if we are denied oxygen, the processes of cellular respiration that generate the vast majority of ATP in our cells require oxygen. So when we are denied oxygen, those processes eventually grind to a halt, and our cells cannot function on the limited amount of ATP that can be generated in the absence of oxygen, and so we die. It is possible to extend the time that we can function in the absence of oxygen, but that requires lowering body temperatures quite significantly. And the longest time someone has been trapped in a cold environment, which is typically trapped under ice in a river or a lake, is about 20 minutes and still being revived without any apparent damage due to being denied oxygen. This is the reason why EMTs are trained to continue to resuscitate a person until they are warm and dead. If you are cold and appear to be dead, the EMTs are now taught to raise the body temperature back to near normal body temperature. If there is still no sign of life, then you're officially dead. Because, as I said, we have been able to resuscitate people who have appeared to have died, but are in fact revivable because their oxygen needs have been decreased by the lowering of the body temperature. But that is still a risky thing to do. There are limits, and the limit appears to be around 20 minutes without any subsequent consequences. So that's another connection to your health science future. You may very well find yourself in situations where lowering the body temperature is one of the things that is required as part of your treatment. It just lowers the oxygen requirement. So another quick break to look at ATP. We're getting towards the end. We've got one more section on enzymes, which is broken up into 2 chunks with a concept break. So we're getting there. So hang in there if you want to go and take a break, bathroom breaks, drink, snack, brain break. By all means, go ahead. I'll still be here. But for those of you who are hanging in there, here are the concept questions. How does ATP typically transfer energy from an exergonic to an endergonic reaction in cells? And if you've got your textbook handy, which you should have when you're following along through this, if you take a look at figure 8.11a, which is the diagram that we were looking at a little bit earlier that shows a form of active transport. Is this a form of passive or active transport, and why? Explain why. Jeopardy music for a few seconds. Okay, so how does ATP transfer energy? Remember, it's all about the transfer of the 3rd phosphate group, the one that is held on by the most stressed out covalent bond in the ATP molecule. The transfer of that ATP reduces the overall strain on the molecule, takes it from a less stable to a more stable position, which means it's going from a high potential energy to a low potential energy state. The transfer of that phosphate group is accompanied by a transfer of energy that's associated with the covalent bond. So it's that transfer of phosphate group that represents the transfer of energy. In the example of active transport, is it, or in the diagram, is it active transport or passive transport? I've already told you it's active transport. Why? Because of the requirement for ATP. If ATP is involved, that's work, that's energy, that means work is being done, that makes it active by definition. If it was not active, then there would be no energy requirement, and it would be passive. So that would be diffusion or facilitated diffusion. Okay, onwards and upwards, let's talk about enzymes. So when we think in terms of chemical reactions, we're thinking in terms of breaking and forming covalent bonds, because those are by definition the bonds that link atoms together in molecules. So one of the issues for cells is that the chemical conditions in the cell may not necessarily be chemically favorable to all the chemical reactions that need to occur. This is one of the reasons why the chemical flexibility of a eukaryotic cell is so great, because you subdivide the cell into smaller compartments, the organelles, and you can then localize different types of chemistry into those organelles and create unique chemical environments that favors that chemistry. So the aerobic portion of cell respiration occurs inside the mitochondria, where the chemical conditions and the structural conditions inside a mitochondria favor those chemical reactions. Likewise inside a chloroplast, likewise inside the endoplasmic reticulum, likewise inside the lysosomes, the peroxisomes, and the nucleus. They're all membrane-bound organelles, and the types of chemistry that go on in those organelles is unique to those organelles, and the conditions in there favor those chemical reactions and allow them to continue. But this is not always necessarily the case. So how can we go about modifying the chemical conditions to favor the chemical reactions? Well, that's where enzymes come in. Enzymes are protein molecules which, by their very shape, allow them to act as catalysts. And a catalyst is typically defined as a molecule or a chemical that participates in a chemical reaction and favors that chemical reaction. Many people say speed up the chemical reaction without actually being consumed by the reaction. So this is not a reactant in the strict sense of the term. Yes, it participates in the reaction just as a reactant would. But when the reaction is over, the catalyst, in this case, the protein enzyme, is returned back in its original form so that it can be reused again. It's recycled. So why do we need catalysts? What is it about chemical reactions that requires the presence of a catalyst? Well, we know that some chemical reactions are described as being spontaneous. That is, you mix the chemical reactants together and the reaction occurs. And that's because all chemical reactions have a requirement to reach a condition called transition state. It requires the destabilizing of the molecules. And you know that when molecules are unstable, that means they're in a high potential energy condition. It's equivalent to being at the top of the playground slide. And to get to the top of the playground slide, you have to climb up the stairs, which is the equivalent to increasing your potential energy. So to reach transition state requires an input of energy, and that energy is called the activation energy. Which is given the abbreviation EA. So this is the activation energy, the energy necessary to reach transition state. And all chemical reactions have a fixed amount of activation energy that's required for the reactants to reach transition state, whether it be exergonic or whether it be endergonic. And in this case, it's an exergonic reaction. You would think that as an energy releasing reaction, you would not need an input of energy, but that is not the case. All chemical reactions have an energy of activation requirement. For a spontaneous reaction, the chemicals themselves represent the source of the energy of activation. So it could be simply that two molecules collide and the energy released in the collision is sufficient to destabilize them, get them to transition state, and they react with each other. That would be the nature of a spontaneous reaction, and the rate and the force of the collisions determines how quickly the spontaneous reaction occurs, because that determines how much activation energy is released in those collisions. But what if the collisions between the molecules is not sufficient to get them to transition state? Well, that means we need an input of energy. And one way to do that would be simply to heat up the solution if we're thinking in terms of a water-based chemistry, which we are in the case of organisms. But the problem with that, as we've already talked about, is that organisms do not tolerate being heated very much. In our case, from 37 to 45 degrees Celsius, and then it becomes lethal. So heating is not an option for organisms. Yet it would be nice to be able to manipulate the system so that the energy of activation, or the energy that is present in the system, would be sufficient to trigger transition state and therefore trigger the reaction. In other words, reduce the amount of energy necessary to reach transition state to reduce the energy of activation. And that is what enzymes do. Enzymes simply reduce the amount of energy necessary to reach transition state, reduce the amount of activation energy. But what is really important is they do not change the amount of energy that's released, the delta G. Delta G remains unchanged. And that's important, because if investing in the use of enzymes was to change the amount of delta G that could be released, that would not necessarily make the use of enzymes beneficial. But the fact that an enzyme does not decrease the amount of released energy, the delta G, means that using an enzyme does have benefit, because it means that you now can either trigger a chemical reaction under the conditions, the existing conditions where it might not have occurred, or speed up the rate at which the reaction occurs, because you don't have to invest as much energy overall to trigger the reaction. It occurs at a lower activation energy in the presence of the enzyme, and therefore you can run more of them, given that you might have a fixed amount of energy. Remember, first and second laws of thermodynamics, they still play out here. So there are some real advantages to using enzymes. Number one, as a catalyst, as a molecule that can be recycled because it's not consumed by the chemical reaction. You can use it over and over and over again. Number two, it reduces the amount of energy necessary to invest in a chemical reaction to make it happen. Number three, you can allow the chemical reactions to occur in conditions that might otherwise be unfavorable, because the enzyme changes all of that. Number four, the delta G is not changed, so the amount of energy that you get out in the presence of the enzyme does not change. Always a good thing. And number five, as it will turn out, enzymes as proteins can be regulated, they can be controlled, and because enzymes are very specific to the chemical reactions that they catalyze, if you can control the enzyme, you can control the chemical reactions that they're involved in. Using an enzyme is actually a big win all around for cells. So not surprisingly, essentially every chemical reaction that an organism carries out has an enzyme associated with it. So there are thousands upon thousands of enzymes in a typical cell as a consequence of this. So there is some terminology that we need to be familiar with when we talk about enzymes. As there is in a lot of things in biology and science in general, there are specific terms that we like to use. So in the case of enzymes, the reactants are not called the reactants anymore. They're referred to as substrates. It's just a special name for the reactants. So when you hear me say substrate, you should immediately recognize that we're talking about enzymes and reactions involving enzymes. So the substrates do interact with the enzymes, but they don't interact with the enzymes just anywhere. They interact with the enzyme through a pocket on the surface of the folded protein that is referred to as the active site. And this forms an enzyme substrate complex that triggers the chemical reaction. So if we take a look at this illustration of an actual enzyme and its substrate, this is the enzyme sucrase, And the substrate is sucrose. And so you can see the active site. It has a very distinctive shape that allows the substrate, the sucrose molecule, to fit in. But notice what happens when it does. The binding of the substrate triggers the enzyme to change shape so that the active site better fits around the substrate. This is called the induced fit model. And what's important here is that only the substrate can trigger this change. And this is what leads to the specificity of an enzyme for its substrate. It may be possible that other molecules can fit into the active site. And as we'll see, that's an important understanding of enzyme regulation, that other molecules can fit into the active site. But it is excuse me, only the substrate that can induce this change in the shape of the enzyme that eventually results in the chemical reaction that the enzyme is catalyzing, that triggers the chemical reaction. So it is the interaction between the substrate and the active site and the induction or the triggering of the change in shape, the induction of the change in shape, that explains the specificity of an enzyme for its substrate. And so it is this binding of the substrate to the active site that is the critical part of understanding how an enzyme works. So what is it about the binding of the substrate to the active site that lowers the energy of activation? Well, there are four possible explanations. Remember, we were talking about collisions of molecules triggering chemical reactions. Well, what if the two substrates, the reactants, have to collide in exactly this way to trigger the chemical reaction? Any other way that they collide simply doesn't do it. Well, what if the enzyme binds to these two substrates in such a way that they're orientated in the way they need to be for the chemical reaction? It actually holds them this way so that they slot together and the chemical reaction occurs. Obviously, that's going to lower the amount of activation energy that's necessary, because all that's needed is for the enzyme to lock them together like this, and then bang, it happens. So that's one way in which it can lower the energy of activation. The next way is simply the interaction between the substrate and the enzyme strains the covalent bonds that need to be broken. Because remember, a chemical reaction is all about breaking existing covalent bonds and forming new ones. So what if the interaction between the substrate and the enzyme strains some covalent bonds? That immediately makes them unstable, which is exactly what the energy of activation is all about. Transition state and the energy of activation is all about making molecules unstable. So if you strain the covalent bonds through the binding of the substrate to the enzyme, you've done exactly what's necessary. You've taken it to transition state without an investment of a huge amount of energy. You've lowered the required energy of activation. The next one's a little bit harder to understand, but nonetheless, it makes perfect sense once you realize what's going on. If you've got a chemical reaction that requires an acidic environment, but the cellular environment is more neutral, that's obviously not favorable to the chemical reaction. But what if the active site, once it completely surrounds the substrate, creates a little microchemical environment that is acidic, because the R groups of the amino acids, remember, an enzyme is a protein, So it's made up of amino acids, and the amino acids of R groups, some of which are acidic. What if there are acidic R groups sticking into the active site of the enzyme? And when the active site folds around the substrate, it creates a little acidic microenvironment that favors the chemical reaction. That would obviously reduce the amount of energy necessary to trigger the chemical reaction, because the enzyme itself is creating this little microchemical environment that is very favorable to the reaction. And it's an environment that's not present elsewhere. So that's another thing we know enzymes do. The last one is all about transferring energy from typically ATP through the enzyme to the substrate via a covalent bond between one of the amino acids in the active site and the substrate as it slots into the active site. And the active site folds around it. So this is also something that we know is involved. Many enzymes are activated by a transfer of energy from ATP. That transferred energy is in turn transferred on to the substrates that the enzyme binds to, and that provides the energy necessary for the chemical reaction. But again, it's lowering the overall amount of energy, the activation energy required to trigger the chemical reaction. These are the known mechanisms that enzymes utilize to reduce the amount of activation energy required for a chemical reaction. And enzymes will use one or a combination of more than one of these mechanisms to trigger a chemical reaction. So this is how enzymes go about reducing the amount of activation energy required for a chemical reaction. So if you want a simple cyclical diagram that explains all of this in a simple illustration, this would be a good diagram. So here are the substrates. Here's the enzyme with its active site configured to bind the substrate. So when the substrates bind, they trigger the change, the induced fit change. The active site folds more neatly around the substrates, brings them together in an orientation that triggers the chemical reaction. That leads to the production of products. The products are not the substrates. They are no longer compatible with the active site, so they are released, which triggers the return of the enzyme back to its original conformation to bind more substrates. And so the enzyme will continue this cyclical binding of substrates, triggering the production of products, releasing the products, reverting back to its original shape to bind more substrates, so long as substrates are present. How quickly does it do this? Well, the average enzyme processes somewhere around 1,000 substrate molecules per second. Some are slower, some are faster. What determines the rate is the concentration of substrates versus the concentration of enzymes. And we can illustrate that with this diagram. So this is substrate concentration, and remember square brackets means concentration, and this is rate of reaction, and Rxn is a shorthand for reaction. So rate of reaction increases this way, substrate concentration really increases this way. So as we increase the substrate concentration, we do see an increase in the rate of reaction. But eventually, at a certain level of substrate concentration, the rate of reaction remains constant, and we see no further increase in the rate of reaction. And we say that the enzyme has reached steady state. And the point at which it tips over is referred to as the saturation point. what this is referring to is the fact that the active site or sites, because many enzymes have more than one active site, are saturated. That is, they're processing the maximum amount of substrate that they can, and adding more substrate is simply not going to allow it to process more because it's already processing as much as it can per second. And so the rate of reaction becomes constant, and we say that it is a steady state rate. I'll put that in here, steady state rate. And so every enzyme has a maximum substrate level that it can process. And for those of you who are interested in becoming pharmacists, this is the reason why pharmacists have to take Calculus 3. Not just Calc 1 and Calc 2, but also Calc 3. Because it's in Calc 3 that you learn the mathematics necessary to be able to model mathematically how enzymes break down substrates. Because enzymes in the liver are responsible for breaking down drugs. And for pharmacists, this is important. And for pharmaceutical companies, this is important because they need to know how frequently you need to take a drug to keep the level of the drug high enough for it to be effective. And in many cases, it is the drug's interaction with enzymes that is important, not only in terms of how quickly are the liver enzymes breaking down the drug, but because the drug is probably targeting a particular enzyme involved in a biochemical pathway that is being, or is the target of the drug for regulation. And simply the drug is targeting a key enzyme in the metabolic pathway to regulate that enzyme to be able to regulate the metabolic pathway. You'll see a little bit more about this as we talk a little bit more about enzymes. So this is what we understand about enzymes in terms of their behavior, in terms of how they are involved in chemical reactions. And you'll learn a little bit more about this through some practical demonstrations in the enzyme lab that you'll do in another week or two that will help you illustrate the procedures that we're talking about here, or the processes that we're talking about here, in a quote-unquote virtual world replica of enzyme behavior. And you'll look at some different features of enzyme behavior, including substrate concentration. Some other features as well. More to come as we go through. So let's move on. What is also important to understand is that the presence of an enzyme does not remove the fact that all chemical reactions, if left to their own devices in cells, would reach equilibrium. Enzymes do not change the equilibrium point of a chemical reaction. In fact, enzymes are perfectly happy to catalyze a reaction both forwards and backwards. All they are interested in is what direction is equilibrium. That is the direction that they will catalyze the chemical reaction in. So to a large degree, the ability to be able to regulate a chemical reaction hinges on the concentrations of substrates, remember that's the reactants, and the products of the chemical reactions, and our ability to manipulate those through chemicals, through drugs. So when we start thinking in terms of being able to regulate the metabolic pathways, we have to think in terms of how do we go about regulating the enzymes? How do we shift the equilibrium in one direction or another through the drugs that we're going to use to interact with the enzymes? Because enzymes really don't care which direction equilibrium lies in. They just will drive the chemical reaction towards that equilibrium point. So not surprisingly, enzymes are also affected by anything that would change the shape of a protein, because enzymes are themselves proteins. So enzymes are very sensitive to temperature, as you'll see, and to pH. They're also sensitive to salt concentration, because salt in a solution interferes with the ionic bonds of the tertiary structure. If that sounds a little bit vague and fuzzy to you, I would suggest that you go back to chapter 5 and re-investigate the section on proteins and protein structure. And then they are also affected by the presence of two types of molecules called cofactors and coenzymes that are helper molecules. So cofactors are things like metal ions. So many of the trace elements that we saw referenced back in chapter 2 that are essential in very, very small amounts are actually metallic cofactors of enzymes. And their presence means that the enzymes function more effectively and more efficiently. Coenzymes are organic molecules that also interact with enzymes to allow them to function more effectively. And many of the molecules that we refer to as vitamins are in fact coenzymes for many important enzymes. So when you think in terms of energy production and cellular respiration, the vitamins that might come to mind there are the B group vitamins. It turns out that B group vitamins, particularly niacin and nicotinic acid, are cofactors or coenzymes, not cofactors, coenzymes for some of the key enzymes involved in the aerobic portion of cellular respiration. And so they turn out to be very important in energy production. So this is the reason why vitamins turn out to be really important, or at least some of the vitamins. So here you can see temperature profiles for two enzymes, an enzyme from the human body and an enzyme from a heat-tolerant bacterium that actually lives in a hot water pool adjacent to the geysers in Yellowstone. And you can see that the enzyme's temperature profile matches very nicely the optimum temperature for the two organisms. We function best at 37. The thermophilic bacterium functions best at around 80 degrees Celsius. Alter the temperature significantly, making it too cold, well, the rate of binding of substrates to the enzyme slows down if it gets too cold. Heat it too much and the enzyme denatures. Remember, proteins denature if you heat them too much. So if you cool it too much, the rate of binding of substrate to enzyme decreases. If you heat it too much, the enzyme denatures because the protein denatures. Likewise for pH, there is an optimum pH for enzymes. So the enzyme known as pepsin that begins the breakdown of protein in the stomach, not surprisingly, works best at pH 2 and doesn't work very well if the pH is too low or too high, around that. Whereas the enzyme trypsin, which continues the breakdown of protein in the small intestine, functions best at pH 8 and won't function at all at pH 2. Neither will pepsin function at pH 8. This is the reason why the food has bile salts and other chemicals added to it to raise the pH as it transitions out of the stomach at pH 2 into the small intestine at pH 8. It favors the two enzymes that carry out the breakdown of protein. So this is the reason why you should not reduce or increase the pH of your stomach, decrease the acidity of your stomach, because the pepsin really does require an acidic stomach to do its thing. Otherwise, you miss out on the breakdown of protein, which is not a good thing. So we do know that enzyme function can be inhibited by the presence of other molecules in the environment. And there are two types of inhibition, competitive and non-competitive. And so these two diagrams illustrate the nature of the inhibition. So here is our enzyme, here is our substrate, and the active site, you can see, is shaped to facilitate the binding of the substrate. But here's another molecule that can also occupy the active site. And if it's in the active site, clearly the substrate can't bind. And so the presence of this molecule acts to block the binding of the substrate. It acts as an inhibitor. And in this case, it's competitive, because it competes with the substrate. Oops, that's not spelled correctly. It should be dose. Let's do it again. So competitive inhibitors are all about concentrations. If the inhibitor has the higher concentration, then it is more likely to interact with the enzyme and block the substrate. If the substrate has the higher concentration, then it is more likely that the substrate will bind to the enzyme and therefore you'll get the chemical reaction. This is why we say it's dose sensitive. It's all about the concentration of the inhibitor versus the concentration of the substrate. And a lot of our drugs work this way. Why? Because we don't necessarily want to shut down the chemical reaction. We want to slow it down. And the way you slow it down is not to completely block the ability to bind the substrate, but just reduce the ability to bind the substrate. And this is where those mathematical calculations about the rate of drug breakdown become really important, because that is how pharmacists figure out how frequently you need to take the drug to keep the concentration of the drug, the inhibitor, high enough to interfere with the binding of the substrate. The alternative is what is referred to as non-competitive inhibition. This is also known as allosteric. Yeah, I should change that. So in this case, what's happening is that the inhibitor is binding to a second site, which is known as an allosteric binding site on the enzyme. And you'll notice that the presence of the inhibitor triggers a change in the shape of the enzyme. This is again why it's called allosteric. It's causing a change in shape, and that change in shape results in the loss of the normal shape of the active site, so that the substrate simply can't bind. And this one is not dose sensitive, because it doesn't matter how much substrate is present, the active site simply can't bind to it because it's the wrong shape. So long as the inhibitor is present, attached to the allosteric site, the active site is the wrong shape to bind the substrate, no chemical reaction. So this is where you would have a drug that is intended to completely block the particular chemical reaction. So this might be a painkiller where you want to temporarily block the perception of pain, by blocking one of the enzymes that's involved in the brain signaling, or the pain signaling to the brain. And so a lot of common painkillers actually work this way, by blocking a key enzyme in the pain transmission pathway. And it's temporary, because again, the non-competitive inhibitor will eventually get broken down by liver enzymes, and the concentration will fall so that it no longer binds to the allosteric site and the enzyme resumes its normal function. So there's a very different intention when you're designing a drug, if you're designing it to be a competitive inhibitor versus a non-competitive inhibitor. If it's a competitive inhibitor, the idea is to slow down the biochemical pathway. And a good example here would be the statins that are used to downregulate the amount of cholesterol the liver makes overnight, because it's making too much for what the body can use. You don't want to stop it, you just want to reduce the amount that it makes, versus a non-competitive inhibitor where the intention is to shut down the biochemical pathway, temporarily at least, and a typical painkiller would work this way. So those are the two types of regulation mechanisms or inhibitor mechanisms that can be utilized to regulate enzymes. So this is our last internal break, where you right down to the very last part of this presentation. So if you want to take one more break, grab a drink, snack, bathroom, whatever it is that takes your fancy. If you need to take a little bit of a brain break, by all means go and take one. If you're hanging in with me, here are a couple of concept checks about what we've just been talking about. Most spontaneous reactions do not occur instantly, but rather occur slowly. Why? What feature of enzymes explains why they are very specific in their action? Little bit of Jeopardy music, and then we'll come back. Okay, let's talk about the answers to these questions. So why are spontaneous reactions slow rather than instantaneous? Because of the activation energy requirement. If there's enough activation energy to allow the molecules to destabilize and react, but it is at a low level, then you're not going to get a lot of chemical reaction, because you have to still invest a lot of activation energy to get the molecules to the point where they're in transition state. So yes, there may be enough energy to hit transition state, but it may not be enough to destabilize a lot of molecules all at once. And so that limits how quickly the chemical reaction can occur. What explains the specificity of enzymes? The fact that the substrate and only the substrate can trigger the change in shape that results in the more neat fit of the active site around the substrate. It is, in fact, the interaction between the substrate and the R groups of the amino acids that line the active site that trigger that change. So only molecules that have the right conformation, the substrate, will align with those R groups exactly and trigger the change in shape. Any other molecule that might fit into the active site won't align with those R groups and therefore won't trigger the change in shape that's implied in the induced fit model. Anyway, one more section to talk about with enzymes, and again, it's all about regulation and what we know in detail about regulation and metabolic pathways. So when we think in terms of enzymes today, and we think in terms of what we know about enzymes, one of the things that we have come to realize is that many enzymes are referred to as multimeric, meaning they're made up of many components or many subunits, each of the subunits containing an active site. So you might have multiple polypeptides, each folded around to create an active site, and all of those, then it requires multiple of those subunits to come together to form the actual protein enzyme. And there's going to be on this enzyme a regulatory site that will bind an activator, and a regulatory site that will bind an inhibitor, both of which are known as allosteric sites, because they're going to cause a change in shape in the enzyme. The enzyme itself may actually oscillate backwards and forwards between its active and inactive form, which is fine so long as that is not an imposition on the cell. What if the substrate becomes available, but the enzyme is constantly wandering backwards and forwards between active and inactive? While ever it's in its inactive form, it obviously can't process the substrate. So it would be nice if the enzyme would lock into its active form while the substrate is present. And that's what a molecule called an activator will do. Activators might actually be related to the substrate or may be produced in the presence of the substrate. There are a number of different ways that this can work, but the point here is that in the presence of the substrate, the activator is produced, it binds to its allosteric site, which locks the enzyme in its active form. And so long as the substrate is present, the enzyme is locked into its active form by the activator. The reverse is true in terms of the inhibitor molecule. In this case, the inhibitor is produced to prevent the enzyme from going into its active form. And so whenever you want the enzyme to be inactivated and not oscillating backwards and forwards, but strictly inactivated, the cell will produce either an inhibitor molecule or maybe another molecule will act as an inhibitor, bind to the allosteric site, and lock the enzyme into its inactive form. So it can't do anything because it's inappropriate for it to do something. It's not in the cell's best interest. Why we know that this is the way in which the cells work, or the enzymes work, is because of something called cooperativity. It was through first recognizing that many proteins are made up of multiple subunits, this notion of a multimeric enzyme, and a simple observation that for many of these, the binding of a single substrate to one of the active sites converts all of the active sites from an inactive to an active form. It's not the binding of a substrate individually to each of the active sites that converts them from inactive to active. It's the binding of a single substrate to one of the inactive sites that triggers the activation of all of them and makes them available for binding substrate. And what that speaks to is the fact that these subunits must be in some way influencing each other, so that the simple act of binding a substrate to one of them influences all the others to become active. There is some form of connection, some sort of messaging between the subunits. And once that was recognized, it changed the way in which we thought about the binding of substrates and what that means in terms of activating the enzyme, and led to the development of the induced fit model that we now know explains how substrates and active sites bind. But it was from there that we further understood how enzymes could be regulated, because it was quite clear that not just substrates, but other molecules produced by cells were regulating enzymes. And that led to the observation of, or the discovery of the presence of activators and inhibitors in their binding to allosteric sites as regulators of enzyme activity. So how can we put all of these pieces together to show how a biochemical pathway could be regulated? Well, the most common form of regulation is what is referred to as negative feedback. Negative feedback is basically similar to what a thermostat does in controlling the temperature in the room. When the temperature gets too high, the thermostat turns on the air conditioning. That doesn't mean that the temperature doesn't continue to rise a little bit above the set point. It does, because it takes a little bit of time for the cool air to come in, mix with the warm air, and bring the overall temperature back down again. When the temperature crosses the fixed point on the thermostat going down, that turns off the air conditioning, but cool air continues to come in for a minute or two, and that continues to drive the temperature down below the fixed point. But now that everything is turned off, and the thermostat won't trigger the air conditioning to turn on again until the temperature rises above the fixed point. So the temperature is never actually at the fixed point. It oscillates up and down above and below the fixed point. And that's kind of what happens in negative feedback. So here we have a biochemical pathway that takes place in your body. It's the production of the amino acid isoleucine, which we can make using the amino acid threonine, which is an essential amino acid, one of the 9, that we need to get in our diet. And it requires a number of chemical reactions that involves removal of an amine group from the threonine and then transfer through a couple of intermediates to the final product isoleucine. Now, the problem for the cell is we need both of the amino acids. We want isoleucine because it is a common constituent of proteins, but we want threonine as well because it's also a common constituent of proteins. But we don't want to make isoleucine at the expense of threonine. Because remember, threonine we can't make, we have to get it in our diet. So we want to maintain an appropriate level of threonine, but also maintain an appropriate level of isoleucine without destroying the appropriate level of threonine. So we could regulate the biochemical pathway anywhere along the pathway, but it turns out that the first step involving the enzyme threonine deaminase is the key step. Deaminase means it removes an amine group, and this is what actually destroys the threonine. So it would be appropriate to regulate this step, because if we block this step, we maintain the threonine. If we allow this step to continue, yes, we lose the threonine, but it allows us to make isoleucine. So this is the key step to keeping the threonine levels up. So how do we guarantee an appropriate level of isoleucine, but still keep an appropriate level of threonine? We use isoleucine as the regulator. It turns out that it's an allosteric regulator of the threonine deaminase. There's an allosteric site on the enzyme that isoleucine can bind to, but it only binds to that when there is a high enough level of isoleucine. What's the high enough level of isoleucine? What the cell needs to maintain that level of isoleucine. So as this pathway progresses and threonine is broken down to become the precursor to isoleucine, the isoleucine level obviously rises. When it gets to its fixed point, it binds to the threonine deaminase and blocks it from working. That shuts down the pathway. That maintains the level of threonine, but allows the level of isoleucine to drop as it's utilized to make proteins. When it drops below the threshold level, it can no longer bind to the allosteric site. That removes the inhibition on the threonine deaminase. It kicks into gear again and starts the biochemical pathway producing isoleucine. The isoleucine levels go up. When they cross the threshold level, they start binding to the enzyme, block its activity, the pathway shuts down again. And so you can see that the level of isoleucine never is constant. It goes up and down below the cell's desired fixed point, just as the thermostat allows the temperature to go up and down around the fixed point. This is called negative feedback. And the hallmark of negative feedback is that it deregulates or downregulates, not deregulates, downregulates the activity of the pathway. In other words, here it's shutting down the pathway, it's downregulating that activity. And it almost always focuses on the key chemical reaction in the pathway, and it almost always uses a key molecule, typically the product of the pathway, as the regulator of the key step. And when we talk about cell respiration in the next presentation, you're going to see this at work, because cell respiration is tightly regulated, and it is the end product of cell respiration, ATP, that turns out to be an allosteric regulator of a key step in cell respiration to regulate the activity of cell respiration. It is a very clear indication of negative feedback. So, not surprisingly, as I've pointed out, many of the drugs that we use, many of the chemicals that we use as insecticides, pesticides, fungicides, any sort of side that kills things affects enzymes. So do antibiotics, so do the drugs that regulate biochemical pathways in our body. They target the enzymes that are involved in those biochemical pathways. And as we'll see next week, Many of the enzymes in cell respiration are associated with membranes and or are found in the matrix of the mitochondrion. So again, we can start thinking in terms of enzymes as proteins, being both membrane proteins, but also being proteins found in the case of the mitochondrion, the functional equivalent of the cytoplasm, what is referred to as the matrix, but remember that is functionally equivalent to cytoplasm or cytosol. So these are, again, some very important ideas to remember about enzymes. Enzymes don't necessarily just exist anywhere. In fact, they don't exist just anywhere. They are either associated with membranes or in some cases, they are found in the cytoplasm or its equivalent in the organelles like the mitochondria and the chloroplast. So that's it for this section. It's been a reasonably long one according to the clock that I've got sitting here on my desk. I don't know exactly how long, but I'll find out once I see what the recording looks like. But again, hopefully you've taken breaks along the way to give yourself a chance to process the information, give your brain a little bit of a rest along the way. We may have one or two more presentations that could stretch this long, but I'm really trying to limit them to about 2.5 hours if I can. If you're wondering why they get to be that long and is it necessary for them to be that long, just remember this. If we were doing the class on campus, we would spend approximately 2 periods or the equivalent of 2 periods a week in the classroom doing this. That's nominally an hour and 15 minutes with ideally a break in between the 2 periods if we had the periods back to back. But if we had the periods back to back, we might actually not have a long break. We might have a short break, or you would have permission to take a break if you needed one. But we would nominally spend about 2 3/4 hours a week discussing course material and another 2 3/4 hours a week in lab doing the lab exercises. So if you are concerned about the length of the presentations, just remember that we would probably spend the equivalent in the classroom every week covering this material. So it's not surprising that some of these presentations get to be 2.5 to 2 3/4 hours long. It's the time that we would normally spend in the classroom. Obviously, it wouldn't just be me talking at length about the details here. I would be expecting you to be doing work away from the class, and we would have question and answer periods and that sort of thing, concept check periods. So what I'm trying to say is that I guess that these presentations are the length they are because they're equivalent to the sort of time that we would need if we were in the classroom. We just happen to have to do it online. Yes, I could break it up into several presentations, but it wouldn't change the fact that you'd still need to spend the time working through the presentation. So it is what is, but hopefully you're finding that they're beneficial, that they're informative, that they're providing you with all the answers to all of the learning objectives, and somewhere in here are all the goodies that you need to answer the exam questions. But as always, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments about anything that's been covered in this presentation or any of the other presentations along the way, by all means, come and see me during office hours. I will be available as always in my regularly scheduled office hours. So double check what they are in the syllabus, come and see me, and let's clear up any questions that you might have. Otherwise, I'll see you back here for the next presentation when we'll be talking about cell respiration. Bye till then.